Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Welcome to Institut Teknologi Bandung. Today on November 21st, 2012, we are very grateful to welcome all of you to the Studium Generale titled Technology and Innovation, How Can Indonesia Beat the Middle Income Trap by Mr. Vikram Nehru, Bakrie Chair in Southeast Asian Studies at the Carnegie Endowment, Washington DC, USA. First of all, we would like to invite the Vice Rector for Academic and Student Affairs of Institut Teknologi Bandung to give a welcoming speech. Please welcome Professor Kadersa Suryadi.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of Rector of Institut Teknologi Bandung, I would like to welcome honorable guest Mr. Vikram Nehru from Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and also Pak Imam from Bakrie Center Foundation, Chief Executive Officer, Pak Brian, Kepala Lembaga Kemahasiswaan, Pak Trides, and also there is another delegation from Bakrie, I think. And ITB feels very honored to have your presence, Pak Nehru, your presence in this important event today. First of all, I would like to inform to Mr. Nehru that one of ITB policy is how to provide our students knowledge, not knowledge only coming from our formal curriculum, but also knowledge coming from prominent person like you. In order the students to have broader and deeper perspective concerning what is happening in the real world. One of action to fulfill this objective is conducting Studium Generale, like in this room now. And in this context, ITB is very supportive to have this Studium Generale. I believe that the presence of Mr. Vikram Nehru in this course allow us and our students to obtain research and deeper perspective on technology innovation, especially in the context of how can Indonesia beat middle income trap. I'm sure that this course allows the students to enlarge their knowledge, skill and attitude in technology, innovation and the broader knowledge. It is great pleasure for us to be here to learn from experiences of Mr. Vikram Nehru. I believe this course will be very beneficial for all of us. Therefore, I would like to express my sincere gratitude to Mr. Vikram Nehru for coming to ITB and sharing your knowledge and experience concerning technology innovation. I wish all audience enjoy the Mr. Nehru's course and find it rewarding. Thank you. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, now we come to the main session. The Studium Generale titled How Can Indonesia Beat the Middle Income Trap by Mr. Vikram Nehru. This session will be conducted by Mr. Imbang J. Mangkuto. Please welcome Mr. Imbang J. Mangkuto.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Sejahtera untuk kita semua. I would like to thank you also for facilitating this event for us, for Mr. Nehru. I'm going to moderate this event. So before I proceed further, I would like to welcome Vikram Nehru to come forward to the stage. Please give applause for him. So before he starts, I'm gonna make a couple of brief, comments on Pak Vikram. So Pak Vikram has been joining the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington DC. Carnegie Endowment is very well known for their independency. So it is perceived as the best and the most independent think tank in the world. So while he carries the Bakrie chair name, it doesn't mean that it doesn't mean that I can tell Pak Vikram what to say and what not to say. So he is very much independent, and people really appreciate that. And then the second point I would like to raise is that ever since Pak Vikram joined the Carnegie organization in October 2011, right? And it was quite also a surprise to me that he's been a very productive individual. So I think since October last year, there's been tens of articles, commentaries, interviews that he has been through, and the information about his activities actually can be looked up at the Carnegie Endowment website. To get into Carnegie Endowment website, you can actually go through our website, the Bakrie Center Foundation. It is very simple, www.bcf, BCF, Bandung Charlie Foxtrot, bcf.or.id. So if you look up this website, you can get all the information that has been produced, or articles have been produced by Pak Vikram, and you can also go through them to Carnegie Endowment website. So I'm not gonna extend my introduction. I would like to welcome Pak Vikram. Basically, Pak Vikram will give a lecture in about 30 minutes or so, and then he will continue with the Q&A. And hopefully that will be sufficient. Otherwise, we can always extend, for sometimes if there are a lot of questions. Please, Pak Vikram.
Thank you very much, Pak Imam. Vice Rector Suryadi, members of the faculty, friends, it's a great honor for me to be here today. I hope you don't mind. I like to walk and talk at the same time. It's difficult to do two things at the same time, but I like to do them, and I will, in the course of this discussion, I'm going to be asking you questions. I hope you don't mind. Right, so my first question is, how many of you actually study economics? How many study economics? No one. How many study business? Business, management. Okay. So, which faculty is most represented in this audience? I guess it's difficult to ask, but how many of you do engineering? Engineering, mechanical engineering, electrical engineering, chemical engineering? A lot of you. Okay, so I'm speaking to engineers. And what are the other areas, Pasuryani? Architecture. How many of you do architecture? Okay, petroleum, oil and gas. Okay, so this is going to be an interesting session because I'm an economist. I love economics. It's my passion. I worked for 30 years at the World Bank. 10 of those years, in fact, I worked in Indonesia. Once in the early 1980s and once during the Asian financial crisis. I was here right through from October 1997 to 2002. So I was here during one of Indonesia's darkest periods. Many of you may not remember that, but I certainly remember it. And it was remarkable to see how Indonesia has transformed itself and become one of the most impressive economies in all of Asia. In fact, Indonesia today has a growth rate which is higher than any other country in Asia except China. Right? Now, I want to get immediately to the title. It's very difficult for me to see my picture up there, by the way, but I'm going to have to get used to it. The title, Technology and Innovation, How Can Indonesia Beat the Middle Income Trap? Have any of you ever heard of the phrase, the middle income trap? You have? Well, that's excellent. Some of you have heard of that phrase. This is a complicated issue. So I want you to stick with me. If you have any questions while I'm speaking, feel free to raise your hand and ask. You can always also ask questions afterwards, but if you have a burning question, feel free to raise your hand and ask. Let me start by talking about the middle income trap. But before I do that, I want to talk about what is middle income. What do we mean by middle income? Now, here we're referring to countries, right? Countries that fall into a middle income trap. Indonesia a middle-income country? Is it a low-income country, or is it a high-income country? What do you think? Middle-income country. Absolutely. Indonesia is a middle-income country. These are incidentally definitions which are used by the World Bank, but are now employed throughout the world. Countries that have, roughly speaking, a per capita income, an income per person, average income per person, below $1,000 per year, are low-income countries. And roughly speaking, countries which are between $1,000 and $10,000 per year per person are middle-income countries, and countries that are beyond $10,000 are considered high-income countries. So that's very simple, right? It's a very simple relation. What do you think Indonesia's per capita income is? 3,000. Anybody else? Any other takers? 3,000. That's absolutely correct. It's $3,000 per capita. In fact, if you look at the gross national income, not what Indonesia produces, but actually the income that Indonesia earns, it's roughly speaking slightly below 3,000, say approximately $2,500 per capita if you look at gross national income as opposed to GDP. But you're absolutely right, GDP per capita is $3,000. But I'm going to focus on gross national income per capita, which is about $2,500. What do you think is the per capita income of a country, let's say the United States? What is the per capita income of the United States, roughly? Any takers, any ideas? What it should be? The per capita rate of Indonesia is 2,500. What would the United States be? It doesn't matter if you're wrong, just take a guess. It's about $50,000. So it's roughly speaking 20 times that. These are all very rough numbers. I've rounded them out to make it simple, but you can see that the United States, which is $50,000 per capita, Indonesia 2,000, there's a big difference. But it's important to know that there are countries right across that spectrum, from around $600 to $700 per capita, extremely poor countries, to extremely rich countries, and there are countries in between. Let's take Thailand. Thailand is approximately $4,000 per capita. China is approximately $7,000 per capita. All middle-income countries, $7,000 per capita. Malaysia is around $8,000 per capita. Singapore is actually around $45,000 per capita. Just to give you an idea. So there are countries that are absolutely across the spectrum. Now, one of the most interesting phenomena, if you look at countries over the last 50 years, from 1960 to 2010. From 1960, a large number of countries have gone from low income and become middle income countries. And Indonesia is one of them. Indonesia is one of those countries that has successfully gone from low income to middle income countries. When I was in Indonesia in the early 80s, I worked here from 1981 to 85. Indonesia at that time was a low income country. But it successfully has become a middle income country, and as I said, its growth rate is very impressive right now. Now, the interesting thing is that while many countries have gone from low income to middle income countries, very few countries have gone from middle income to high income. Very few countries. In fact, of 101 countries in 1960 that were middle income, only 13 countries have become high income. And of those 13 countries, 6 are in Asia. Can you tell me which 6 countries, give a guess, which 6 countries in Asia have gone from middle income to high income over the last 50 years? Very obvious ones. Singapore, South Korea, excellent. Taiwan, Japan, excellent. Hong Kong, if you consider it a country, it's an economy, it's now become a part of China, but Hong Kong. So these are the countries that have done remarkably well in Asia and gone from middle income to high income. What is quite amazing though is that a large number of countries didn't make it. In fact, in Latin America, virtually all the countries of Latin America were middle income in the 1960s, and they remain middle income today. There are many countries elsewhere in the Middle East, America, Southern Africa, and countries in East Asia, where they've remained in this middle-income trap. Right? Now, why? What is it that stops countries? The countries find difficult in moving from middle income to high income. What is this trap? Right? In essence, this trap is that countries that develop, like Indonesia, their real wages rise. What is development? Development is increased productivity of people. You become more productive. When you become more productive, you earn more. Your wages are higher, your salaries get higher, you have a higher standard of living. But as you earn more, it becomes more and more difficult for countries to remain competitive in the products that brought them to that position of middle income. What brings countries to middle income status is producing goods that are labor intensive, that require a lot of labor and don't require a lot of capital. After all, what is it that poor countries have an abundance of? They have people, but they don't have money, they don't have capital. So they get from low income to middle income by becoming more productive, using that capital effectively and becoming more productive. But as you get richer, it gets more difficult to remain competitive against the other low-income countries in the products that made you rich in the first place. You have to start producing new products, right? Now, those new products are more sophisticated from a technological standpoint. Incidentally, when I say products, I don't necessarily mean goods. I also mean services, right? So, for example, banking is a service. Communications is a service. But getting into banking, getting into communications, getting into transport, these are all services, and competing with the advanced countries is difficult. And there are two reasons why it's difficult to compete with advanced countries. Can you give me one of those two reasons? Technology. Thank you very much. Technology. Getting access to technology is difficult. Why is getting access to technology difficult? It's difficult for two reasons again. First is that when countries develop, when firms, enterprises develop technology, they don't like to give it to their competitors, right? They patent that technology. This is perfectly acceptable because if you don't patent technology, you're not likely to do research and development and invest in new technologies. You want to take advantage of those new technologies. If somebody else simply takes them and uses them, then there's no benefit to you of creating a new technology. So, getting access to technology is difficult. But there's another dimension which is equally problematic in getting into production of goods that compete with advanced countries. Can you think of that second barrier? It's a barrier to entry. Technology is one barrier. What is the other? I'm going to give you the other barrier. The society, it's not something that you've heard of very often. It's scale. Producing goods to scale. Now, when you invest in research and development, when you invest money in creating new products and services, the way you recoup that money is by charging an additional amount on each product. But because investment in research is so expensive, you have to produce a large amount of products so that the additional cost is relatively small and you can sell those products. So, give you a good example. How many, take aircraft. Aircraft is a very advanced technology sector, right? How many companies in the world produce aircraft? You give me a name of one aircraft production company. Airbus. Another one? Boeing. Two big ones. I mean, there are small ones. There's Embraer in Brazil. There is Commandeer in Canada. These are all sort of other aircraft companies. But the big ones are Airbus and Boeing. The reason why you have just two is because unless you produce hundreds of planes of a particular kind, it's very difficult to recoup your cost of research and development in producing a new aircraft. So for example, now the Dreamliner, the 787 Boeing Dreamliner has been produced. For Boeing to break even on the research and development of this new aircraft requires the production of hundreds of those aircraft, right? And that's why it's very difficult for a new company to break in. How can Indonesia break into the aircraft market? It needs two things. It needs the technology and it needs scale, right? So, unless of course you produce a brand new product, that's what somebody like Bill Gates did when he started with computers and created Windows, right? He created a brand new product. But even computer companies require technology and they require scale. Now the big battle that's taking place between 3 or 4 very large companies in the area of software and computers and telecommunications. It's Apple, it's Windows, it's Google, you can name the few. So scale is a second very important area. Why it's difficult for middle-income countries to get into the high income bracket. Now I want to spend a little time explaining how some countries, what leads to this pressure. The pressure is, as I said, when wages rise, right? Take China. When wages rise, in China wages are rising at 20% a year. Productivity is rising even faster than 20% a year. Productivity rises, wages rise. So now China is having to figure out how do we get more value per person? Because when you pay a person more, that person has to produce more. How do you get more value per person in production? Let's take a product, the iPod. How many of you use iPods? Nobody uses iPods here. Oh my God. How do you listen to music? Anyway, let's take an iPod because there's a study of the iPod. There will be lots of now products that resemble the iPod. Say an iPod costs $100. Actually, it doesn't cost $100. It costs about $400. Let's say $100 to make it simple. When you look at an iPod, it says made in China, right? How much of that $100 is actually produced in China? Would you know? Well, there was a study of this. It's between $5 and $7 of the $100 is actually value that is added in China. 70% of that value, 70% comes from the United States. The bulk of that 70% is in design. It's just the design. It's somebody who's thought of it, the designing that went into it, the ideas that went into it. And the remaining part of the United States is marketing. It's also very sophisticated and it leads to actually very high value creation because it makes people want to buy that product. Whereas China gets 5 to 7% for assembly of the components. The components themselves, many of them are manufactured outside China. They're manufactured in Taiwan, they're manufactured in Malaysia, they're manufactured in Korea and Japan. They're shipped to China and they're put together in China. So when it says made in China, actually that's not quite true. It's assembled in China. My submission to you, when you enter the workforce, when you start with jobs and you work in businesses, I want you to think differently about how the world is evolving. The world is changing. It's no longer a world where countries produce products. Countries now do tasks. The task that China does is, at this point, assembly. The tasks that are performed in the high-income countries are design, marketing, creating sort of new products. The tasks that are in middle-income countries, upper middle-income countries, are fabrication, manufacturing the components that go into those products. These are different tasks. In India, for example, India has become a part of the value chain, but primarily through computers, because a lot of the tasks that Indians do are back office tasks. Things like managing expense accounts, things like doing research for specific companies, things like having call answering systems which provide after-sales service. So when I call up and say that my fridge is broken in Washington, it's probably a guy in India who's answering, even though he has an American accent. Because it's cheap to get an Indian to do it. So the tasks that Indians are doing in the service sector are primarily tasks which are related to services and not production. So the world is changing, and increasingly products are produced by countries, shipped to other countries, and then those products are shipped to a third country, and finally they're assembled and put together and sold. That's the way the world is. This is the result of globalization. Now, China, I'm using China as an example, but it's true of other countries. When China's wages rise, China is having to start thinking about how it can add value rather than just in assembly. It wants to get into fabrication, it wants to get into design. But there is something called a smile curve. It's a U curve. It looks like a smile, right? As a product goes through its product cycle, the first part is design, that's high value added. Then there's fabrication, that's somewhat lower value added. Then there's assembly, which is the lowest value added. Then there's packaging and shipment, and then finally there's marketing. Countries which are at the bottom in the assembly want to move up that smile, go up into packaging and marketing, but also go up in the other direction into design and fabrication. And what is pushing China is rising real wages. Let's come to Indonesia now. What's happening to real wages in Indonesia? Real wages of unskilled labor. Can somebody tell me what's happening to real wages of unskilled labor in Indonesia for the last 5 years? They're actually declining in real terms. How can you have a country which is growing at 6.5% a year, where the growth rate of the economy is one of the best in Asia, also be an economy where real wages of unskilled workers is declining? How is that happening? How can that be? One of the results of this, incidentally, is somebody's getting that income because production is rising, but it's not going to those who are unskilled, or frankly the majority of the population. It's going to a few people. In fact, inequality in Indonesia is rising the fastest amongst countries, apart from a few others. It's one of the fastest rising inequalities in the world in the last 5 years. This is something that people don't necessarily sort of recognize. So what do people do when real wages decline? When you can't get a job in a factory, where do they go? You can't get a job in a firm. They go into the informal service sector. This is the term that we use. What is the informal service sector? Informal service sector is doing whatever you can to keep body and soul together. Going to preparing nasi goreng in a warung. To prepare nasi goreng in a warung, or to sell cigarettes, or to have a little toko, or to be a pembantu in somebody's house. This doesn't require a lot of technology, it doesn't require a lot of skill. It's readily available technology, people can easily pick up those skills. And that's how they keep body and soul together. So the informal service sector employment in this country is rising. People argue that because service sector employment is rising, it's a good thing. Actually, it's not a good thing, at least in the informal services sector. Because it is a safety net for the poor, right? So to my mind, when we think of technology and innovation in Indonesia, the first thing that has to be done is to raise real wages, to raise productivity. So there is pressure to innovate. At this point, there is no pressure to innovate. There's a large amount of cheap labor. You continue producing stuff which uses cheap labor. No problem. There's no need to innovate. There's no need to have new technologies. Why is it that we have this problem in Indonesia? The reason, in my view, is that the pattern of production in Indonesia is such that it does not lead to employment. It leads to output growth, but it doesn't lead to employment growth. That output growth is largely coming from the natural resources sector. Minerals, mining, metals production, tree crops production. These are all capital-intensive products, they're out in the outer islands, right? And they don't employ a lot of people. They employ a lot of capital, don't employ a lot of people. That's one of the reasons why you can have growth in very little employment. Manufacturing is an area where you can get a lot of employment, labor-intensive manufacturing. But guess what's happening to manufacturing in Indonesia? It's declining as a share of GDP. It's declining as a share of employment. And it's declining as a share of exports. So according to me, manufacturing is the sector, is the area where countries can get both growth and employment, and as a result, wages rise. When wages rise, there's pressure to innovate, and you gradually become a high-income country because you start competing in products which high-income countries compete in. But that first has to happen. Why is it that manufacturing in Indonesia is not developing as rapidly as it should develop, right? And in my view, there are many reasons. And you know those reasons. You know those reasons very well. Yesterday, I spoke at Surabaya, at Airlangga University in Surabaya. And we flew from Surabaya to Jakarta, and then I had to go from Jakarta to come to Bandung. Guess how long it took me to go from Jakarta to Bandung? 5 hours. It took me 5 hours. Apparently, it takes people a lot longer than that. It should have taken me 2 hours, right? It took 5 hours. We're stuck in traffic. But infrastructure, it's obvious to all of you, you have to live this every day. Infrastructure is a huge constraint of manufacturing. Manufacturing requires infrastructure. It requires ports, it requires roads, it requires communication facilities, it requires power, energy production, energy distribution. Manufacturing requires infrastructure, and this is clearly one area where there is a serious problem in Indonesia, infrastructure. But there's another issue in Indonesia, which is preventing manufacturing in particular. And that is, it's very difficult to start a business here. It's very, you know, if you look at the ease of doing business, you don't have to take my word for it, go to the website and type in Doing Business Survey, just doing business. Is the doing business indicators prepared by the World Bank for 183 countries. Where do you think Indonesia lies in the ranking of 183 countries in the Doing Business Survey? The ease of doing business. It ranks 129th. It's very low. In fact, when it comes to entry into business, it's more like 145. When it comes to enforcing contracts, which is essential for any business, not just in manufacturing, it's 154th. So clearly, there's an issue here about the ease of doing business. You're not going to get a lot of manufacturing coming in unless it's easy to do business. There's a second aspect of doing business, and now I'm coming into a very interesting theory in economics. It's called the theory of creative destruction. You've heard of creative destruction? Sometimes in order to create, you have to destroy, right? In economics, Schumpeter, a very famous economist, introduced this theory of creative destruction, whereby firms, you have to have a system which allows firms to go bankrupt easily because they're not competitive. They go bankrupt, and then the capital that they use and the labor that they use go and join other businesses which are more competitive. 80% of businesses in the United States which are started in any one year go bankrupt within the same year. It's very easy to exit a business. It's very difficult in Indonesia to exit a business. If you find it difficult to exit, you don't want to enter a business. It's difficult to exit because the procedures for bankruptcy are very difficult. You can't let go staff, you can't let go employees very easily. You can't simply declare bankruptcy which court and protects against creditors. It's just very difficult here. So entry and exit are important for a competitive, flexible economy which then can grow rapidly, raise productivity, raise wages, and create pressures for innovation. So regulation is very important. Let me give you one example of this. It's in employment. Indonesia has one of the highest severance rates. That is, when an employee, suppose a company gets into trouble, demand drops, in terms of supply. You can't employ all your people. You have to ask them to leave, right? In Indonesia, it's almost impossible to ask people to leave because under the law, you have to pay them a very high severance payment so that they can. The motivation is a good motivation. It protects that individual, but the result for companies is, if it's so costly for me to get rid of labor, I don't want to hire anybody. So even within manufacturing, companies don't like to hire. They prefer to use capital-intensive technologies rather than labor-intensive technologies because it just gets too risky for them to hire labor. So what do companies do in Indonesia? They use contract employees. And you must have heard of this, right? Contract. Everybody now uses contract employees. But there's a discussion going on in policy, at the policy level in Indonesia, to ban contract employment. Again, the intention is a good intention. They see this as a way that firms exploit labor. The idea is a good idea. But the consequence can actually be negative. So just having a good motivation doesn't necessarily lead to a good outcome. Something to keep in mind. Think through these issues carefully when you enter business. Think through these issues carefully when you enter government. That good motivations doesn't necessarily lead to good policy. Yesterday when I was at Aula University, somebody stood up in the audience and said, what do you think of the minimum wage issue here in Indonesia? And it was a very good question, and I answered it based on my knowledge yesterday, but last night I looked at the literature on minimum wages in Indonesia. And the literature on minimum wages in Indonesia shows that if you raise minimum wages well above the productivity level, several things happen. First, the small firms are hit more than large firms. Small firms let people go because they can't afford that minimum wage. Secondly, non-production workers are hit harder than production workers, that is those who do administration, sales, anything other than actual production, get hit harder than production workers. But most worryingly of all, women are let go more quickly than men. So in fact, if you look at the aggregate analysis of minimum wage increases, very dramatic increases, it actually hurts people. It hurts people because they then move into the informal service sector, they have a much lower paying job, and as a result, in fact, inequality rises further. So, good motivations don't necessarily lead to good policies. And my suggestion to you is that you have to create the pressures for innovation and research and development by first increasing real wages. To do that, you have to increase the manufacturing sector. To get the manufacturing sector to grow fast, you need to create conditions for manufacturing. There is no shortcut in development. No shortcut. You have to do the hard work of building and developing an economy. I'm going to make my last point, and then I'm going to open it up for questions. My last point is that in order for people to respond to the demand for skills, to respond in terms of producing more value, being more productive, you need education, right? You need people to become more skilled. Now, education is a critical part of the story because it provides the supply side. It's the capabilities of individuals who can then produce more when there is a demand for their skills. Indonesia did the most remarkable thing in 2005 to introduce this bill that required that 20% of the budget has to be used for education. I think it's one of the few countries in the world which does this. It's quite remarkable. It's very impressive. Indonesia has now got universal primary education, almost universal secondary education. But I just want you to think a little bit about this. It's not just the money that's spent on education, it's the outcome. What is the outcome? How skilled are the people who actually emerge from high schools? How skilled are the people who actually emerge from universities? Now, I know in Malaysia, for example, Malaysia spends more as a share of GDP on education than any other country in Asia. Yet the biggest constraint for Malaysian businesses is skills. The the salaries of university leavers in Malaysia is declining. Yet, there's a shortage of skills. How can that be? How can that be? When there's a shortage of skills, you pay more for skills, right? You'd expect that the real wages would rise for skilled workers. It's declining. The reason is the quality of those people who are emerging from universities is actually declining. Firms and enterprises, businesses complain that the graduates that are coming out of universities have to be retrained, almost trained from scratch. And that's costly for them to do. And that's why they offer lower salaries, because they're actually having to invest in them before they become truly productive in order to command higher salaries. Now, I want to come back to Indonesia. I don't have the data, actually, for Indonesian university-educated folks, people like yourselves who will be leaving university. You're very fortunate that you're in one of the best universities, or perhaps the best university in Indonesia. So you are the cream of the cream, right? And you will command a huge premium in labor markets. But you have to think of those who are not as fortunate as you. There is a test called the PISA test, Program for International Student Achievement, PISA. You can go to the website, check this out, the PISA. And it's done in 75 countries. And it's done for 15 and 16-year-olds who are finishing high school in 75 countries. And these are developing countries. This is done by the OECD. It's a very good test. You have to be very careful to make it comparable across countries. Which country, actually it's a city, which city in the world do you think comes out number one amongst the 75 countries for the capacity of students in math and science? Any guesses? It's a very unusual place. It's Shanghai in China. Comes out number one. It's ahead of the US or Scandinavia, it's ahead of Europe, and Japan, Korea, where you expect the most hard-working students to be. It's Shanghai. Where is Indonesia in this? Unfortunately, Indonesia is ninth from the bottom. So, why it is remarkable that Indonesia is spending more on education. It is very impressive. The challenge to Indonesia now is not spending more, but extracting higher quality in students, making sure that they actually learn something. 1/4 of the students that were tested in Indonesia scored 0 and 1 out of a range of 0 and 5. 5 is the best performing, 0 is the lowest performing. And those who score 0 and 1 are comparable to those people who never went to school in the first place. In other words, they might as well have known nothing, received no education. 25% of those tested in Indonesia scored 0 and 1. This is very worrying. It's something that Indonesia needs to be very concerned about, because this is not the foundation that you want for developing an economy which is going to beat the middle income trap, right, and become a high-income economy. Now, I'm going to end with a little bit of mathematics. Very simple math. You don't have to worry, you're all engineers in any case. It's simple for you. We started with the fact that Indonesia was a $2,500 per capita economy. If Indonesia grows at 6.5%, which was the growth last year, which is a very high growth rate, its population growth is about 1.5%. I'm simplifying the numbers, it's actually 1.4, say 1.5. So per capita growth is what? 6.5 minus 1.5, which is 5% a year. Right? If an economy grows at 5% a year, that is per capita income grow at 5% a year, how long does it take for incomes to double? Quick math. How long does it take for a 5% growth rate to double the original amount? It takes about 15 years, maybe 14 and 15 years, between 14 and 15 years, right? It's very easy to do. So it means that to go from 2,500 to 5,000, it'll take 15 years. To grow from 5,000 to 10,000, it'll take another 15 years. So in 30 years, Indonesia could become a high-income country if it keeps growing at 6.5% a year. If it grows at 7.5% a year, that comes down to 24 years. If it grows at 8.5% a year, it comes down to 20 years. Right? China has grown for 30 years, from 1978 to 2008. 1978 to 2008, an average of 10% a year, 9.9% a year. So they doubled in the first 10 years, doubled again, doubled again. So 2 to the power of 3 is 8. They increased their per capita income 8-fold in one generation. Right? This is something that Indonesia would need to do. Even if it will take 30 years, right? It would be terrific if it would go 8-fold by growing at 10% a year. I believe Indonesia actually needs to be impatient. Impatient, but recognize that there is no shortcut. And Indonesia has to do the right work, hard work to get there. And to do that hard work, it needs the right policies. And we talked about policies, it's infrastructure, it's regulation, it's education, right? These are the right policies. And it also needs a little bit of luck. Sometimes countries get bad luck. Tsunami hits, we have natural disasters, we have sometimes political instability. So it's not just good policies, but it's also good luck. There is a marvelous article which was written in 1993 by a colleague of mine called Good Policies or Good Luck. Actually, you need both. So let me stop here. I'm not sure how long I've taken, I may have taken much too long, but I'd be very happy to answer any questions you have. It doesn't necessarily have to be on Indonesia, it could be on the issue of technology, innovation, it could be on what's happening in the global economy. It's entirely up to you. I'm happy to respond to whatever you ask. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Vikram. Okay, so dear students and Pak Adasan, Pak Brian, and all other instructors who are attending this session. So I welcome questions from any one of you. Please feel free to ask whatever that you think that you want to know. Since you are not economic major, I think that you have more questions than other economic students. So please welcome, raise your question. Don't be hesitant, don't be afraid. You don't have to pay for questions that you ask. Question from this side, probably? Okay, there's one here.
Thank you, Mr. Vikram. Just want to know about the role of university in the advanced country, or how to double the income of the country. Okay.
Well, thank you very much. In fact, there is, you may not read this journal, but there is a journal called the Bulletin of Indonesian Economic Studies, EIES, that's produced by Australian National University in collaboration with Indonesian academics. And they just recently brought out an article on exactly this point, the role of universities in development. One of the interesting things about Indonesia is that the university sector, if you wish, has grown very dramatically. A very large increase of institutions in tertiary education. Tertiary education is anything that is post-secondary. So it doesn't just include universities, it includes institutes of management, polytechnics, you name it, vocational institutions of various kinds. The tertiary education sector has grown very dramatically. Now, the trouble when you have rapid growth in the sector is that the administration of that sector leads to a huge variety in the quality of institutions. You have outstanding institutions like ITB, but then you have other institutions where frankly what you get is a piece of paper at the end of 3 years that shows you're a diploma, but you know very little at the end of the 3 years. The quality of education is not very high. There's a huge variety. And when you're an employer, if you're a bank or a manufacturing firm, and you get somebody who comes from ITB, and you get somebody who comes from another tertiary education institution, right? You take the ITB person. You don't take the person from a tertiary, from a place which you don't know, because there's a quality control issue here. And so people spend a lot of money to get that education, but they don't get the returns. They don't get the returns for it. So a big challenge in Indonesia is that you have to increase the quality of education across the board. And there has to be a much greater effort on the part of the tertiary education system to police itself. But there also has to be an effort on the part of government to ensure that the quality standards employed in tertiary education system are maintained. We have, after all, a Ministry of Education. That's one of their jobs, to make sure that the quality of education is maintained across the board. And that's simply not happening. But last point is that Indonesia, as I said, has these islands of excellence. And this is one of those islands of excellence, surrounded by this sea of mediocrity, surrounded by mediocre institutions. And you have to raise the level of the sea in order so lots more institutions become high-quality institutions. If you look at the top 500 institutions, universities in the world, the top 500, the country which has the largest number of universities in the top 500 is the United States, about 143 universities. And by the way, this also you can get on the web. There are 2 or 3 different rankings. There's the Times Education Supplement ranking, there's the ARWU ranking, and there's a third ranking, which I forget, but there are 3 different ranking universities. I'm giving you rough numbers. About 143 out of 500 universities in America, the top 500. Guess which country has the second largest number of universities in the top 500? China. It wasn't China last year, it was the United Kingdom last year. But China has overtaken the United Kingdom this year. When I say this year, 2011 was the last year for it. China has now got 42 universities in the top 500, compared to, I think, 38 in the United Kingdom. And then you get a bunch of others. India has only one university, the Institute of Science. Indonesia doesn't have any. So, even the islands of excellence, even EDA, the islands of excellence, have a challenge for raising their performance to the point where they can be counted as amongst the top 500 universities in the world. This is the challenge. So I'm not just saying it's the other universities in Indonesia, also the best universities in Indonesia. Because when you have outstanding universities, by the way, and you have an outstanding education system, other people want to come to be part of that process. And you were talking about this interesting discussion that you had in Guizhou about exchanging 100,000 Chinese students with 100,000 Indonesian students by 2020. Having students move across boundaries is very important. It's very good when Indonesian students go abroad, but it's also very good when outside students come to Indonesia. This learning is very important. When I go to Beijing these days, it's phenomenal. The number of foreign students and foreign professors that are now teaching in Beijing, because there's a lot of money in Beijing now. So, a lot of people now go to Beijing. The atmosphere, the discussions that take place are very alive, very active. They're good for China because they're bringing fresh ideas into China. But they're also good for those students because they're learning about a system which is unique. There is no system like the Chinese system outside China. Maybe Vietnam, but frankly, no system like the Chinese system. And there are a lot of good things about the Chinese system, also bad things about the Chinese system. It's important this process to learn. I think Indonesia has quite some ways to go to improve its quality, but I want to make one last point. There is no question that the literature shows that high quality education leads to good economic outcomes. That association is very clear. And so, without a good education system, it's very difficult to get good economic outcomes in people in the middle income.
Other question, probably? Yes, right here from. Please also mention your name and your department.
Hello, good morning. My name is Taufik from Electrical Engineering. I have 2 questions. First, what is the first thing to do for us as students to increase Indonesian GDP. Second, what are the factors that affect GDP for country? Why Indonesia only gets 6.5% a year and China 9%?
Thank you. And this reminds me, Taufik reminds me that, we have a non-economist in the audience. I assume a lot of things when I talk to you as an economist. Let me start with the second question, Taufik, first. What leads to GDP growth? What goes into GDP growth? Right? There are actually three things. Very simple. The first is, to produce stuff, you need capital. Right? Resources, capital. It comes in different forms. It comes in physical capital, it comes in human capital. When you learn things, you have human capital. You need capital. So if you grow your capital, you get more output. Right? Simple as that. The second thing you need are people. You have more people, and they have access to capital, you get more output. Right? And the third thing, which is the most critical, is efficiency. Efficiency. The efficiency with which you use the capital and the people to drive growth. Right? So it's capital, it's labor, and it's efficiency. I'm simplifying it. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but this is the simple three things. Indonesia has an abundance of people, no shortage of people. In fact, even with a population growth rate of 1.4%, Indonesia's labor force is growing and will continue to grow for at least another 20 years. So people, the availability of people is not a problem in Indonesia. It's a problem in China, by the way. In China, the labor force is going to start shrinking, or has probably already started shrinking, right? And China is going to get old very quickly because a fewer number of people are being born in China. A large number of people are getting old in China. And when you have that situation, you have to worry about the old in relation to the number of people who are actually doing the work or creating the goods. But Indonesia is not in that situation. Indonesia's problem is also, I don't believe it's capital. Indonesia has an abundance of capital. You have very rich in natural resources. I think you have a large amount of human capital. And I think you have a large amount of social capital. What I mean by social capital is the way you're organized as communities, the way you're organized in households. There's an enormous stability and a richness in Indonesia which you don't find in many other countries. And one should never discount the role of social capital. So Indonesia has an abundance of capital. The challenge in Indonesia is the efficiency argument. How do you get more efficiency? And you get more efficiency by having a system that promotes competition. It promotes this entry and exit firms. It promotes trade. It promotes the exchange of ideas. It promotes flexibility in the way people are hired and so forth. The labor market functions well. So that efficiency, creating a system that encourages efficiency, is key. And I think that's where Indonesia can do a lot more. Now the way this is measured, there's a very technical phrase in economics, it's called total factor productivity growth. In countries which are developing, growth primarily comes from accumulating capital and from the labor force. But as your per capita income grows, and you go from middle income towards high income, you have to get more and more of your growth from total factor productivity growth, from increasing the efficiency of it. That's where you need to extract it. That's where you need to go up the value curve. Get into design, get into new ways of doing business. Suryadi was talking to me just before the session, and he asked me about innovation. Question on innovation. What is innovation? When you think about it, what is innovation? How do you define innovation? Innovation is simply a new way of doing something better. We're doing it better by doing it differently. It doesn't have to be in machines. It doesn't have to be in hardware. It can be in what's called non-process process innovation, just by doing things differently. Right? The way you organize an office, the way you interact with each other, work in teams instead of individually. Anything that leads to a better outcome. And societies and economies are always experimenting on how to do things better. That is innovation. The job of governments is to create the environment that encourages innovation, that motivates people to do things better, that creates incentives that if you do things better, you're rewarded for it. Right? That's where efficiency comes in. They asked me the first question, what do you need to do as a student? I think the question was to contribute to GDP. Is that correct? Well, the answer is simple. Study hard. Study hard, do well, be open to new ideas. I find it very encouraging that your engineering students, the architecture students and so forth, you still come for a talk which is on a complicated topic like beating the middle income trap. That's very encouraging, keeping an open mind. You know, I worked, as I said, in the World Bank for 3 decades, a long time. And one of the important things you learn very quickly in the World Bank, or any other organization for that matter, is to be incredibly humble. There's a lot of knowledge out there in the world. You have to find it. Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore used to tell his government, senior government officials, when they wanted to introduce a new policy, he would say, go out into the world and find it, because there is definitely someone in the world somewhere who has done this before. Learn from them. And they would go out and study what others have done, come back with those new ideas, and of course adapt them to Singapore. It's exactly what China is doing. China is sending millions of students abroad. It sends its staff, its senior government officials. When I worked on China last year, I worked in China with the Development Research Center, which is a think tank for the cabinet. It's called the Development Research Center of the State Council. They were remarkably open. They said, tell us what are other countries doing to solve this problem or that. Being open to new ideas is very important. But then you need to have the skills and the education to extract the right lessons from those new ideas. Not all ideas are good. You can get bad ideas as well. Right? You have to have the education and the facility to sift out the bad ideas and recognize good ideas. For that you need a good education, which you're getting here. But the worst possible thing is if you emerge with an education and you have a closed mind. I think that would be terrible, because then you don't learn. Learning is a lifelong process. As I said, I worked for 30 years and I'm working at Carnegie, and I can tell you every day I'm learning new stuff. It's a phenomenal experience. I love it. It's a great journey. And so that's my last piece of advice, is to enjoy it while you're doing it. It's a phenomenal process. And you're very, very fortunate to be in a great institution, in a great country, with a great future. And I hope you contribute a huge amount. Thank you.
Next question, yeah, in the middle.
Good morning. Okay, my name is Alam from Mining Engineering. I have 2 questions. The first is, you say the manufacturers industry is the main thing for increase our income. So I want to ask what specific thing to do in mining industry we can do to beat this trap. And then maybe the second is out of topic question. I just want to ask to you what happiness means for you. Thank you.
Excellent 2 questions. In fact, the second question is a particularly important question. What does happiness mean to you? I'll come back to that. Let me start with the first question. The first question is on mining. How can mining contribute? Mining is an unusual activity. Mining extracts goods from the ground for use, and it's very valuable. Iron ore, copper ore, oil, gas, these are very valuable commodities. It's a national asset. Right? this belongs to the nation, in a sense. It belongs to the nation. Now, how do you convert a national asset and make sure that it's used for the nation? That's the challenge in mining. See, in mining, the actual cost of mining is a very small part of the total value of the product. The actual cost of extracting it is a small part of the value of what you get out of the ground. The difference between the price of iron ore and the cost of extracting iron ore, or the difference between the price of a barrel of oil and the cost of extracting a barrel of oil, that is called, in economics, it's called a rent. Mining is very high rent activity, large economic rents. Now, some countries give that rent, and the private sector just takes that rent. High profits, people enjoy it, and that's the end of it. The nation as a whole doesn't benefit. The farm that extracts the mineral resources benefits. That's it. The other is where you have a lot of corruption. Some of those rents are taken away by government officials who have to be bribed to get a license in order to be able to mine. Why do you need licenses to mine? You need licenses to mine because the value is so great, right? Otherwise, you have to be sort of careful to make sure that those who mine products then pay a substantial part of that rent as taxes. That rent does not belong to them, it belongs to the nation. They should be properly recompensed, properly compensated for the cost, adequate profit, technology to be adopted. I'm not denying that. All of those things are important. The cost, the profit, etc. is important. But there's still a large amount that's left in rents that have to be, that are a national resource. The challenge in developing countries is that when you have a large amount of mining activity, large amount of natural resources, it leads to a large amount of greed. You get systems where individuals, whether they're government officials, whether they're individual entrepreneurs, extract those rents for themselves. The challenge of government is to use those rents to better the nation, whether it's education, whether it's infrastructure, for development. Those rents need to be used for nation building. That's the challenge in mining. That is how mining can contribute to a nation, right? And it's a damn difficult thing to do. It's a very interesting statistic that most countries that have large natural resources have very poor economic performance. There's a negative correlation between economic performance and the endowment of natural resources. For this reason, it leads to systems which extract those resources and those rents for a select few, leaving the rest. Well, Africa is a good example of that. Africa is one of the most richly endowed continents on earth. And the continent has been raped and plundered without any benefit for the people of Africa. It's a tragedy of huge proportions. Indonesia, unfortunately, has a good system, but it must be always wary of making sure that natural resources are used for national development. Now, on happiness, economics, the study of economics has done a big disservice to the world. Because economics has assumed that higher production means higher happiness, more happiness. The more you produce, the more income you have, the happier you are. You know that's not true, right? There are now new studies on happiness. There are actually studies that have been on happiness in the United States and elsewhere. As your income rises, your level of happiness rises. But at a remarkably low level, it actually levels off. At a surprisingly low level of income. The more you earn doesn't give you more happiness. And that level is between in the United States, is between $60,000 to $80,000 a year. So people who earn $2 million a year are not any happier than people who earn $70,000 a year, right? That's one point, that the economics of happiness shows that our happiness doesn't come from material standards of living. A lot of it comes from our sense of community, our sense of family, our sense of security. Do you know, if you live in an economy where there is no law and order, right? There's always a threat of a crime. You have to have high gates, high walls, you need security guards, you need locks. All those things actually lead to a rise in GDP. Right? Somebody's earning income from building those, but are you better off? No. You're doing it, those are not economic goods, they're economic bads. There are such things as economic bads, things which are negative. Pollution is an economic bad, it's not an economic good. Congestion of traffic is an economic bad, it's not an economic good. Crime is an economic bad. The breakdown of social fabric, when you have ethnic warfare, when you have communities fighting communities, or religions fighting religions, these are bad things. So societies must recognize that what leads to happiness is so much more than economics. And it's interesting that some countries are recognizing this. When I was in China, one of the big things that we were focusing on in China, and the Chinese recognize this, is how do you measure the welfare of people which goes beyond economic standards of living? Because Chinese local governments respond to incentives. If you tell them you have a target growth rate of 10%, they'll deliver it. You know, it's a communist society. They give the orders, people follow. If they give the order, we want it to be happier by 10%. It will be a very interesting experiment, right? As to what do they do to become happier by 10%? Better environment, better schools, better communities, better sense of safety. These are all important things. So I think you raised actually a very fundamental point. There is one country in the world, one country, which measures its economy not with gross domestic output or gross domestic product, but with gross national happiness. Did you know that? Do you know which country it is? It's a little country, Bhutan. Bhutan is a little kingdom in the Himalayas in India, which has adopted gross national happiness as its measure of progress, not gross national product. And people, when they did this initially, people laughed at it. You know, these guys are crazy. Now, the president of France put in a blue panel commission, which included Joe Stiglitz, who's a Nobel laureate, and another guy called Michael Spence, who's also a Nobel laureate. And their task was going beyond GDP. They wanted to measure progress which goes beyond just production and output and material standards of living. How do we measure better health? How do we measure better education, better social peace? It's a fantastic question. And it's a question which we haven't yet answered, but we must answer. What you measure is what you get. If you give people targets and ideas and they can measure their progress, they will get to it. It's when you don't measure it, you don't know you're making progress, you don't get to it. It's difficult. You don't know whether you've made any progress as a community, as a society. So you actually raised an incredibly important point, and I want to thank you for raising it.
Please, next question. Probably on the website, we have also another from like that, but let's give priority from the left side here. We have two questions here. Please come forward.
Good morning, Mr. Vikram. I'm Fajria from chemistry. In chemistry, we do many research like polymer, fuel cell, and conductor, but I cannot see a clear step to bring those research to industries. But I've heard some countries have do that, like South Korea and Malaysia. And I want to ask you, how government like South Korea, Malaysia, and maybe India to scale up the research to industries? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. That's also an incredibly important question, because you put your finger on a point which is well worth emphasizing for all of you who are doing research. And that is, research is very important. Having the capability of doing research is very important. But research for research's sake doesn't help an economy. Research output, for it to benefit an economy, has to be commercialized, has to eventually lead to some commercial result. One of the most interesting things in China, for example, is that China is now becoming one of the largest contributors of journal articles and patents in the world. It's beginning to challenge even the United States and Europe in generating patents and generating journal articles in the best journals in the world. But where China has not succeeded yet is exactly the point which Fajria raised. The point of commercializing those ideas. That is a pretty darn difficult thing to do. The way it's done, and you've taken some good examples, the way it's done in countries like Japan, South Korea, the United States certainly, which is one of the leading innovators and researchers in the world, is by bringing together universities and businesses. Having universities as islands of excellence without connections to the commercial mainstream of an economy does not help with the commercialization of products. You know, I was in Malaysia, we were advising Penang. Penang is a city which is north of Kuala Lumpur, right? Penang is very keen to develop into a world-class city. To develop into a world-class city requires a lot of things. It requires a good environment, good infrastructure, good governance, but it also, in my view, requires an excellent research capability. But our main advice, that they have this excellent research capability, our main advice is to build industry-university linkages. And the way you do that is by inviting industries to contribute towards research issues that they would like to finance. When I was in Korea, I went to Ulsan, and I was actually investigating how they were developing new technologies and new ideas in industry. When the managing director of a firm came to me, and he said, I want you to come with me. He said, I want to show you something. So I sat in his car, and he drove up a hill, and he came to a school. It was a high school. It wasn't even a university, it was a high school. And he took me in, and there was a hall, which was bigger than this hall. It was a huge hall, filled with machines. They were filled with numerically controlled, computer-driven machines, and some were, of course, manual-driven machines. And he said, this is what we're doing to create skills in schools, because I am running short of skilled labor, especially lathe operators, high-precision lathe operators. And this school has allowed me to invest in provide them with machines so that those who come out can then be employed and be remarkably productive in industry. Not that he was talking about a very specific, not research, but a skill. But the same can be applied to the research issue. If industries are invited to participate in the research process by creating demand for research within universities. Having said that, I would also urge Vice Rector, you and others, that what universities do produce in the form of research should be available to everyone. Just because a company finances research does not mean that the fruits of that research from a university belong just to the company. This is a fine line that you have to walk, that you want to attract funds for research from industry, you want them to be interested in what you're doing, guide you in some respects as to the issues that they face, but that the results of the research in a public university, publicly funded university like ETRA, should be available for the public, not for some individual or some company. So that's an important little addendum that I would add to this very good question that you raised. Thank you. Was there a second question that you had? No, just one. Okay.
Okay, thank you, Pak Vikram. Apparently, some of the students will have to attend their class at 11. So, we are now about 15 minutes to 11. I think I'm going to suggest if there is one brief question from this side, very brief one, so we will end in 5 minutes also, please. Thank you.
Informatics and engineering. I would like to ask about how you said starting a company, and actually a company in Indonesia is very hard. And that companies usually die the same year they were born, like they were made. So I would like to ask, like, what aspects do small startup companies need to know?
It's a very good question about startup companies. Well, you asked me a question which I don't know the answer to, because I'm not a businessman myself, right? So you should ask somebody in business. But I want to make some general points about startup companies. And this was actually a point made to me by my Chinese colleague when I was doing this China report. It's a very simple point, it's a very obvious point, but it's a point worth making. The point is that you don't know where good ideas come from. Nobody knows where a good idea comes from. It could come from somebody in a garage, or it could come from a multi-billion-dollar research facility. We just don't know, right? The whole idea of new ideas is that they come from somewhere, but you cannot foretell. So, how do you get maximum number of good ideas? Is by getting as many people as possible involved in creating ideas. The more people that are involved, the more good ideas will emerge. The more research that is being done, the more good ideas will emerge. So the point that my Chinese colleague was making to me was, the problem in China, he said, is a lot of our research is done in large state enterprises. So when you have a large state enterprise producing research, that it's not like it's very inclusive, not like a lot of people thinking about new ideas. There's one company thinking about new ideas, and as a result, their commercialization rate is very poor. The consequence of what I'm trying to say is that the more startups you have, the more people who have new ideas and able to start businesses, the more likely you're going to have innovation. That is absolutely central. And that's why startups are so important. Right? Now, I don't know enough about startups in Indonesia, but one of the things that startups do require is, of course, first of all, a good idea. They need a really good idea. But then they need the finance to be able to take that good idea and bring it to market. And that finance normally in advanced countries is through venture capital companies. Banks don't like to take such high-risk bets. These are very high-risk bets. Venture capital companies may bet on 100 ideas, of which 5 they do well, 95 fail. But those 5 that do well have such a high rate of return, it makes it possible to finance the remaining 95% of the losses. Right? So you do need that kind of infrastructure for startup companies. And I'm not sure about what the venture capital situation is in Indonesia. I honestly don't know, but it's worth finding out if there are venture capitalists around, and I'm sure there are some who will be prepared to assist you if you were to start up a new company. And you're in a very exciting field. And by the way, informatics is an area where I believe Indonesia has tremendous potential. It's already a very rapidly growing sector, very rapidly growing. And I think this country has tremendous potential which has been untapped so far. So I think you're on to a very good thing. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. I think let's give a big applause to I also would like to thank everybody for the excellent questions. So apparently, even though they are not economic background, but the quality of questions actually are very excellent. Now, I would like to return this to our MC and thank you again for this session.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, at this special moment, ITB would like to present a memento to Mr. Vikram Nehru. Please welcome Professor Kadersa Suryadi.